experienced teacher has just now pulled in making a fashionable entrance. I'll go ahead and get things started up here right quick for you. We'll start off with our prayer list. Make sure I'm on the right page. That's Siv Hooker, Wanda and Ronnie Payne, Betty Walker, Carol Epperson, and put some extra prayers up for Carol. She fell and she's got a gash on her head and some other things where she's fell again. Janet Buckhart, she did get the feeding tube put in, and she is at home now. Velma Grubb, Jody Chenault, Daniel Smith, Anthony Chappell, Louise Atkins, Teresa Smith's sister, Chris Hall, Ruben Vasquez, Harvey and Shelby Sawyers, Teresa Smith, Terry Payne, Yogi and family, Jerry Shropshire, Helen Bennett, Jamie Buckhart, Edie Gammons, Darrell Anderson, Richard Gibbons, Karen Hardy, Ryan, Ray Haynes, Brandon Wolf, Linda Roberts, Joey Nelson, Wendy, Ted Chaplin, Lee Atkins, Mike Atkins, Bobby Krause and wife, Nathan Atkins. Got Jimmy Upchurch on here, just so everybody knows he did pass away. They had to unplug him and he went peacefully. But we know where he went because we was here when he came to this altar. Donna Pepinos, Kenny Gammons, Dante, Frank Danley, Roger Danley, Dale Drew, Mabel Nelson, Zeke Simpson, Ronnie and Christy Davis, Dalton Scepter, Coy Pepinos, Justin Pepinos, Thurman Potts and wife, Rusty Angle, James Hawks, Gary Flippin, Mitchell Freeman, Mark, Greg Abels, Gurney Atkins, Pauline Webster, Becky Stokes, Bill Sperling, Jimmy Williams, Johnny Ashburn, Nancy Rees, Ricky Allen, cancer, Jennifer Ferris, Warren and Rita, Jimmy Bobbitt, Warren and Rita, I think they're traveling this weekend for their anniversary. Just keep them in prayers. Anna White, Ricky Hudson, Joey Falk, Peggy Ardner, Sandra Martin, Daphne Simpson, Mike Donathan, and I didn't know Jerry's name was already on here, but I want to put them back on. I'm going to go ahead and say them again. Jerry and Bonnie Shropshire. Bonnie, she's having a time for her back. All the will is gather around this altar and get the service started, and then we'll turn it over to our guest teacher.
Kind of gracious Heavenly Father, in the name of Jesus, we come to you just thanking you, Lord, for the blessings of this beautiful day that you've given us to come out to your house this morning. Father, we thank you for each one that's made their way out, Lord God. You've heard their names that have been read. You've heard any requests that have been made, Lord God, that you've posted in your hand. Father, we pray that you'll touch each one according to your will. Lord God, be in this service today, be in this Sunday school, be the one that stands to teach. Father, indeed, with us in the worship hour, we give you thanks, honor, praise, and glory, and all praise. So in Jesus' name we humbly pray. Amen.
Which one is it?
It don't matter to me. I just want to mention it again.
It is service.
All right.
All right. Did anybody get the Bible questions? I got a hand back there in the back. Go ahead, Beth.
Anybody hear me? I can't tell if you can tell, but I'm kind of nervous. So, what I had in mind, I couldn't really get peace for sure about what to preach about, but I kept coming, or not to preach about, teach about. I'm sorry. Again, I'm nervous. I'm gonna stumble over all my words, but when I was thinking about trying to do this, I couldn't get away from the same thing kept coming back, and it was just wanting to talk a little bit about the Apocrypha and what it was, the history of it, things like that. So that's what I want to try to teach us a little bit on, is what the Apocrypha was, why it sort of matters even maybe to us today, give you a little bit of its history and background, and just talk a little bit about it. I've got tons of notes about things. I've been researching this for a long while now. So when I say the Apocrypha, I don't know if any of y'all know what that means, but it was originally in the first printing of the King James Bible in 1611. It's been removed since then, and I'll get into why. But the word Apocrypha means like a hidden text, but that's not really the way it's used here. These are just ancient texts that were considered non-canonical, but still good for like teaching and stuff like that. But they're not considered inspired books. They never were. They're not considered to be books from the apostles or from Jesus. They're considered basically Jewish writings that were good for teaching and edification, things like that. It wasn't anything that was ever. I'm not attempting to say they're on par or ever were on par with the Old Testament and the New Testament. They're not even close. They're just extra books that were in the original Bible back in early Christianity all the way up until about 1862, and then were removed. And so I'm going to start talking a little bit about them, if that's okay. If anybody has any questions, feel free to stop me. If I get going too fast, feel free to slow me down. But the Apocrypha, as we know it, refers to a collection of ancient Jewish texts that were written during the intertestamental period. So that period between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament is where the Apocrypha was originally put into the Bible. It spans from about the 4th century BCE to about the 1st century. In other words, that era I was talking about. And so the Apocrypha was written in Greek, Aramaic, and Hebrew, and was composed by Jewish authors living at that time under Greek rule. So this is also known as the Second Temple period. So it was kind of an important time with a lot of religious and cultural change going on for the people who lived as Jews at the time. They were following the conquest of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BC. They were really influenced by Greek culture, and they had to really their culture was a pushback again off to the side sort of, and they had to sort of assimilate somewhat with the Greek culture at the time. So that's what the Apocrypha kind of is. Talk just a little bit about the history of it, where it comes from, its background. So what's in the Apocrypha as far as, well, no, hold on a second. I'm getting ahead of myself again. I told you I would do this. I'm sorry. Okay, so the apocryphal texts, here's kind of what the background of them. They were included in most of the early Christian manuscripts and codices. They were included alongside the canonical books, but were never considered canonical. I want to keep mentioning and putting that up there. They're never considered as important as the Old Testament, obviously not as important as anything from the New Testament either. But they were used in Christian worship in those early days. They were preached and taught from the time that I'm talking about, this intertestamental time, and after the time right before when Jesus came. They were read aloud in church services, cited in sermons, and written about in theological papers and stuff. And they were used mostly as sources for moral and spiritual instruction. It really helped to reinforce text did, the importance of the Christian tradition, where Christianity had come from that intertestamental period to get to where they were. The Apocrypha actually played a huge role in helping to form early Christian doctrine. I realize it's been I'll talk about this too, it's been changed. But as far as ethics and spirituality, it was a big part of that. Book of Wisdom, for example, one of the books in the book of Sirach provides insights into moral wisdom and the pursuit of righteousness. So they're not canonical books. They're not as important as those books like Solomon and things like that. They are almost add-ons to that, if you will. And the book of the Maccabees talks a lot about the Christian belief of martyrdom and the hope of an afterlife. And this is, before the New Testament had been written. Books like Tobit, Judith, they offer narratives of faith, courage, and divine providence. Again, while this was widely used in early church communities, the Jewish people never accepted it as part of the canon, as part of what went with the original Old Testament books. But they were used, and they were intermingled with the preaching at the time, at this time when these were being taught in the churches before the arrival of Christ, and even during the arrival of Christ, these were still in circulation in his time. Something kind of interesting about them is the Apocrypha was part of the King James version of the Bible for 274 years until it was officially removed in 1885. The translators of the King James Bible did believe these books were written to prepare people for Jesus, similar to how John the Baptist did, so that they really thought these were important books at the time. And I know some things people have changed, and there's been some questions about the authorship and some of the things like that, but at the time these were written, they were considered very important books. And you won't find them in very many printed Bibles today unless you go out of your way to get one that does have them in it. Excuse me. So just to kind of put a point to that, to show that they were considered and why they were in the King James and why they were considered important, there were several councils and synods back then who affirmed the Apocrypha as part of what should be in the Bible. Some of those were the Council of Hippo in 383 AD. One of the earliest churches to address the issue of biblical canon. It affirmed that the Apocrypha did belong in the Bible with the Old Testament books. The Council of Carthage in 397 AD also, they addressed the issue of biblical canon and reaffirmed the decision of Hippo regarding the inclusion of the Apocrypha. The Synod of Rome in 382 AD, they convened under the authority of the Pope at the time, and I know a lot of people also think the Apocrypha is just in the Catholic Bible, and it is considered canon in the Catholic Bible, but it's not canon for us. But I feel like it's not important for getting saved, don't get me wrong, but I feel like if you're interested in reading a little bit more about the writings at the time, then they're important books, and they're not bad books to have. They're not inspired. I'll put it that way, basically. But I don't think there's anything wrong with reading them as long as you can have proper perspective and realize they're not as important as the Old or the New Testament. Yes, sir.
To me, it's not, I've read some of the books, and things are clicking in my mind. Matter of fact, this year has been in the last few weeks. I wish I'd known you were going to be teaching this. I try to remember more and put it, but I was reading something. There's even some places in Scripture where it said, doesn't it say in
There's places that references it.
that what is that book? It's one of the books because they refer to it.
Right. The writers of the New Testament knew it. It was New Testament. It was, yeah.
To us today. I like my Schofield reference.
Sure.
I used to have a set of Matthew Henry commentaries as a reference. You got one of the books of Enoch,
Right.
and what does the Bible say about Enoch?
book of Jude actually directly quotes from the.
It's not that these books are wrong. It's just like you already said. They felt like you said, oh, it goes inspired
Right.
or what that says. Well, that's the reason they will. If you think today, I'm say it'd be about the band of books of the Bible.
Right.
I don't like that term,
No.
band.
They were not banned.
They did. They were taken out, I think, to hold them on confusion.
Yeah, it was part of it, absolutely.
And
You're exactly right. Everything you said spot on as far as one of the other reasons they took it out was the cost of printing Bibles at the time was pretty expensive. So they figured if we take out this part of this non-essential part of the Bible, we can print more Bibles and get the essential parts into more people's hands. That was another reason they did it.
in their place, I think too, that it says somewhere in the King James Bible, it talks about, people getting scolded, said that the prophet that you, killed before the altar or something like that, I can't remember exactly what it is. But we don't see that anymore. If I'm not mistaken, that's in Bell and the Dragon.
Yeah, exactly. Which is another
There is
yeah.
reference to these books
right.
in our Bible.
And so that's one of the reasons I kind of feel like they're important is the writers of the New Testament had access to this and read this. This was referenced to them in some ways, like you said. So that's the reason I feel like it's somewhat important for people to at least know it exists and know if they want to go read it that it's there. And so that's the reason I decided to kind of just talk about it a little bit because I don't feel like enough people know about it. It's not, like I said, it's not as important as getting your soul saved. It's not as important as knowing what the Gospels say. It's not as important as even knowing the authorized history of the Old Testament. But I feel like you can get some wisdom, you can get some knowledge, especially about what was going on at the time by reading these books. And if that's something that interests you, like it does me and some other people, then I think these books, at least want to give people the knowledge of these books and know that they were part of the King James Bible. They're okay to read, like they were part of it, but they have been removed since then for different reasons, like you said, to reduce confusion and also to get down at the time the cost of printing the Bibles. So I do think there is some usefulness to these, though. All the way up to 1672 AD, the Synod of Jerusalem even said that these were okay. And so these books have never, like you said, they're not banned books. They're not forbidden books. The books of the official Apocrypha, they're not. Now, there are other books that people will try to throw under the Apocryphal label that are considered like New Testament Apocrypha that are more with the Gnostics, and I could get into all that if you want me to, but see, some of that stuff is not, they've not all been, there's not been any agreement on those, I'll put it that way. Some of the stuff they found in Dead Sea Scrolls, some of the stuff they found in other stuff, but they can't really pin down the authorship of those. They really don't know who wrote those. They don't think they were written at a time when they purport to be written. So that's a whole nother sort of topic there. But yeah, the New Testament Apocrypha is very different from this, from the official Apocrypha that was included in the King James Bible. So I don't want anybody to confuse that if they hear about another book that's apocryphal, like the Gospel of Thomas or something. I don't want you to think that's what I'm talking about, because it's not. Also, just one more example, the Council of Trent in 1546 also reaffirmed that these books were, the Deuterocanonical books, could be an integral part of the Old Testament if given the proper context. So I'm going to kind of give you some pros and some cons, or some reasons why people wanted the books and some reasons why people disagreed with having the books in there. Like you probably already know some of this, but I'm going to. So the apocryphal books were part of the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, the Septuagint, which was widely used in the early Christian church. They were considered important spiritual texts by those early Christians. And they do provide context for understanding the New Testament. They contain wisdom books, historical narratives, and some additional insights into the Jewish thought and practice between the Old and New Testaments. They do offer moral teachings, prayers, and stories that you can read that will also give you a better understanding, or sort of give you additional things like for the book of Daniel, for example, Bel and the Dragon is sort of an extension of that, another story from Daniel's time. The works like the book of Tobit and the book of Sirach have shaped Christian art and literature throughout history. People have, again, referenced these repeatedly. The early church fathers, like Augustine and others, referred to the Apocrypha. These texts had reverence in the formative years of the Christian doctrine that has come up to us eventually today. And another reason to have them in there, in my opinion, of course you can put them in the back, you can put them wherever you want to, but they do have some educational benefit if you just want to study the history of the Scripture and the development of the canon, and especially that intertestamental period where there was a time between prophets and the coming of Jesus. These sort of do flesh that period out. If you kind of always wondered where that time period went, it's basically in the Apocrypha. Yeah, it was about 400 years in that time period between basically 400 BC and then the coming of Christ. Second here. So that's one of my next points is the Apocrypha sort of sheds light on this historical time. It's also called Second Temple, the time of the Second Temple in Judaism, which is the whole backdrop of the New Testament. For example, the first and second Maccabees is about a revolt led by the Maccabees who were under cruel Greek rule at the time, and they revolted to get the temple back. They rededicated the temple back to God. And these are events that really shaped Jewish identity and the expectations that a Messiah was coming. The wisdom books, like the book of Sirach and the Wisdom of Solomon, they really do parallel some of the wisdom books of like Proverbs, Job, and Ecclesiastes. They're very similar. They just sort of continue to explore the themes of that we all know to be good is fear the Lord, value the wisdom, pursue a righteous life, and things like that. So they don't take away anything in that regard. They just add to that. The Apocrypha also sort of helps, for some people it can help them understand a more fully realized New Testament if they see that period that's missing there and they understand what was going on during that time. In the book of 2nd Maccabees, for example, you have the first mention of the resurrection of the dead, which was hinted at in the Old Testament but never explicitly said until the time of Jesus. Well, they mentioned the idea of resurrection from the dead in 2nd Maccabees. So you can sort of look at it as a precursor to the New Testament's emphasis on eternal life and resurrection. That's another thing you can glean from that if you'd like to read that. Also, the ethical and moral teachings, which really resonate with the ethical teachings of Jesus. They don't. There's like, for the example, the book of Tobit emphasizes charity, prayer, and fasting as central to a faithful life, and it echoes a lot of the teachings of Jesus from the Sermon on the Mount. So you can again sort of see how these go together in a lot of ways. They don't go against anything. They're sort of almost messianic in some ways as far as the things they talk about, because they are looking for a Messiah at this time too, because this is before the Messiah's come. This is the intertestamental period, so they're looking for a Messiah too. And the church fathers in the early days, again, they cited these texts all the time, interwove them into the preaching at the time, so they really helped shape the Christian doctrine back in this time period. And I really do think it serves as a crucial link between the Old and the New Testaments. It just gives you an idea, if you're interested in that intertestamental period, of what all was going on. Like I said, there's a lot of history in there, and there's a lot of books in there that are they're good for reading. They're good for what you might call, I guess, edification or something. They do a good job of telling you what was going on and giving you a fuller picture of what was going on during that time. And so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the reasons why people wanted them removed, and some of the people who were against it. So during the Reformation period, one of the biggest opponents to the Apocrypha was Martin Luther, the Reformist. So he questioned the historical accuracy and the authorship of certain of these books. So the Apocryphal books are sometimes attributed to well-known figures, such as Solomon, Ezra, and the Maccabean leaders, but Martin Luther questioned that. He didn't know if these were accurate, if these books were written by the people associated with him, so he had some issues with that. And again, I'll get a little further into this here. He questioned the canonicity of the Apocrypha based on his theological and doctrinal considerations. He advocated for return to biblical canon as it was recognized originally with the primacy of the Hebrew Bible. So basically, like you said, he was worried people were going to get confused, if they were interwoven or put in with the Old Testament. So he wanted the authority of the Old Testament and the apostolic writings to really be the focus of the Bible, which you can understand. We can understand that reasoning. I apologize, I have to keep referring to my notes. But Luther's again questioned the historical accuracy and reliability of certain events and narratives. He expressed skepticism about some of the miraculous stories and the accounts found in these texts. Again, he emphasized the primacy of Hebrew Scripture as the foundation of Christian faith and doctrine, and he argued the Apocryphal books were not part of the original Hebrew canon and therefore should not be accorded the same level of authority as the canonical books of the Old Testament, which I think, again, I don't think there's any question about that. They don't have anywhere near that kind of authority. And maybe at this time there were some that thought they did. There certainly could have been. I'm sure there were, actually, because you had so many different sects all trying to, the sect here and a sect there, all trying to say their part of Christianity is right and what was wrong. You had to sort of help codify the groups to get a common message. So I understand his objections to it. I can certainly understand them. It's one thing that'll be interesting about Martin Luther, though, is he also expressed reservations about other books in the New Testament. He particularly had issue with the Epistle of James, the Epistle to the Hebrews, the Epistle of Jude, and the Revelation of John. He questioned their canonicity. I'm sorry, were you asking? Okay, sorry. He questioned their authority to varying degrees. And I'm going to tell you a little bit of what he had problems with these books. Now, Martin Luther famously referred to the Epistle of James as the Epistle of Straw in his preface to his German New Testament that he printed. He criticized it for what he considered his emphasis on works and justification by faith alone, which seemed to conflict with his understanding of the Pauline theology. But he did include them in his German translation, but he did have issue with them. He also ended up including the Apocrypha, even though he took issue with them. His problem with the Epistle of the Hebrews is he wasn't sure about the authorship. He questioned whether it was really written by the Apostle Paul. Again, he had a problem with the idea of the intersection of faith and works. But again, he did include it. So eventually he came around on it. With the Epistle of Jude, he had sort of minor objections because, and this is one thing we talked about, he didn't like that it cited non-canonical sources such as the Book of Enoch. He was upset at that. He thought, that shouldn't be in there because we don't have a reference to what they're talking about. But he did include Jude in his translation. And finally, the Revelation of John, he had significant reservations about. He questioned its authorship, its historical context, and he really was concerned about the symbolic imagery and the apocalyptic visions. He didn't think it would really help to bring people to the faith. So while he didn't advocate for the removal of it, he actually recommended that it be read with caution and given like a warning and not be used for establishing doctrine. So Luther he may have been on the right track, but he wasn't always perfect in his criticism either. He criticized a lot of different books. He was trying to look at things under the view of the Reformation, which you have to think about at the time. The Puritans were trying to purify the word, if you will, and distill it down to its. So you can understand why he had some issues with some of these things. At least I think I understand why. King James of England, the one who commissioned to have the King James version, he also had a kind of a complex stance on the Apocrypha. He did include it between the New and Old Testaments, but he himself did not regard these books in equal authority to the canonical books of the Bible. But he did respect the historical and traditional significance of the Apocrypha, and he did authorize its inclusion in the King James for edification and educational purposes. So when people talk about the 1611 King James, which I have a copy of here, the Apocrypha is in there. It's always been in there, and it was up to the 1880s, 1860s, 1880s. I'll talk about that here in just a second. So there have been other outspoken critics of the Apocrypha, obviously. Other than Martin Luther, you had John Calvin, who's in, if you know anything about Calvinist theology, he was the author of that. He didn't reject it, but he did want them separated from the other canonical books, and he did say they were useful for edification and instruction. He just wanted to make sure that people could discern that these were non-canonical writings, and they didn't have any authority from Jesus or from God. So I understand. Again, you can understand that. John Wycliffe, who wrote the Wycliffe Bible in the 14th century, he was critical of the Apocrypha. His translation back into Middle English, he did not add the Apocrypha in. So it's sort of been a little bit of a hot potato at times. So one of the biggest things, we talked about some of the reasons why it was excluded, and I have some information on that. Apologize. So every edition of the King James Bible published before 1666 included the Apocrypha, though they were separated to denote them as not equal to Scripture. In 1826, the National Bible Society of Scotland petitioned the British and Foreign Bible Society not to print the Apocrypha and to allocate no funds to pay for the printing of the Apocryphal books anywhere. And they reasoned that not printing these books would prove to be less costly and allow them to reach more people with the canonical books of the Bible. And so their petition in 1826 eventually led to 1885, when the British and Foreign Bible Society did make the decision regarding the printing and the distribution of Bibles. They decided to no longer print the Apocrypha between the Old and New Testaments. It did mark a departure from the long-standing practice of printing the Apocrypha in Bibles, and their reasoning behind the decisions goes into the cost and efficiency of printing the Bible, obviously, increased production cost, and caused complexity for Bible publishers trying to figure out if they want to put it in between the New and the Old Testament at the back of the book. So the aim was to streamline the production process and reduce the expenses to get more Bibles into more people's hands, so it wasn't done out of malice. Also, some argued about the clarity of the canon. They argued that without the Apocrypha, people would be more focused on the canonical writings. They wouldn't concern themselves with these non-apocryphal. These writings don't really help anyone get saved, so they didn't see the need for it. Their decision to remove it in 1885, though, contributed to the widespread practice of all of our Protestant Bibles not having the Apocrypha, and that really continues to today unless you go out of your way to find one with it. So the history of it, to me, is pretty interesting, of how it's been seen over time. Again, I want to emphasize the Jewish community never accepted the Apocrypha as part of authoritative Scripture. And I've said that probably too many times, but I just want to make sure I'm not trying to say that it was ever held at that same reverence or anything, because it wasn't. I want to give you a little bit of an overview of what's in the Apocrypha, the books themselves. Just talk a little bit about what books are in there. So what I have here is an Apocrypha with, it's just the Apocrypha separated, the King James version of it, and it has the books that were originally printed in there. They're also in this 1611, but it's a little harder to read because of the printing. Presses at the time couldn't make U's, for example, so V's were substituted for U's and things like that. But the first two books included were 1st and 2nd Esdras, which is basically ends up being Ezra, is who's attributed to writing these. The first book of 1st and 2nd Esdras, it's about the rebuilding of the temple in the Persian period, and the story of the scribe and the priest Ezra who brought the law at the time. Now, sometimes people, again, they'll try to confuse you. They'll try to split these books up into 4 and 5 Ezras. But officially, there was only 2 books in the original Old Testament Apocrypha. the book of 1st and 2nd Maccabees. This is set during the reign of the Greek Empire. It tells how the Greek ruler Antiochus attempted to suppress temple worship and destroy the practice of Jewish law, which caused a Maccabean revolt. This revolt talks about how it freed the Jews from the control of the Greek Empire, and they were able to rededicate the temple. This actually is kind of an important book because the rededication of the temple is still commemorated every year in the festival of Hanukkah to this day. So, I mean, that's, if you want to look at that, it's kind of an important part of history. The Maccabeans.
I remember studying about them in high school.
That's amazing. They're still not mentioned.
In history, and I suppose enough, I hadn't in church or anything like that or connected with the Bible. I've never heard any, what's a Maccabee?
Right.
And these books have not a use.
Yeah, they're not, like, again, they're not inspired, but they are useful. And the history, I think the history portions like 1st and 2nd Maccabees are especially so because it really gives you the roots of the festival of Hanukkah, where they rededicated the temple and after liberating it from Greek rule, basically. The Greeks were really cruel to the Jews at this time period, and it talks a lot about that in these book of Maccabees. And then the second book of Maccabees just sort of recaps, and it also talks about how God intervened to help them win these battles. So again, these books have some use, in my opinion. The book of Tobit is attributed to Tobias. It describes how God will test the faithful, he'll respond to prayer, and he will protect the covenant community. It basically tells the story of two Israelite families who go through these trials and come out on the other end with God's protection. So it's another, again, I don't see, there's some edification to be had through that book, I feel like. Book of, well, yeah, in some ways it is. It's a testimony to God's faithfulness. Again, like I know we have a lot of it in the regular Bible, but it also adds to this. It's just more. I don't think you could have enough of that. Like, how can you have too many people telling you that God's he'll do what he says he does? I mean, it's hard to argue with saying that there's too much of that. I don't know, but that's just my opinion on it. The book of Judith talks about a Jewish widow who used her beauty and charm to kill an Assyrian general who was going to besiege the city. And with this act, she saved nearby Jerusalem from total destruction. So this is again another history part of the book here that you could argue that whether you believe that it was her beauty, but whatever the reason was, she did save Jerusalem from being destroyed back at a time when an Assyrian general was trying to destroy Jerusalem again. And this is back in the intertestamental period where there's not a lot of common knowledge had about this time. So the book of wisdom, which some people call the wisdom of Solomon, it's generally dated to the mid-century BC. And so the central theme obviously is wisdom. It talks about, here's things I like about this book. It says wisdom is the perfection of knowledge of the righteousness as a gift from God showing itself in action. And it also talks about a direct relation to God and that wisdom is with God from all eternity. And so to me, that sort of dovetails into the New Testament really well as far as any wisdom you've gotten. Of course, it dovetails into the books of Solomon if you want to look at it that way too, but any wisdom that a person gets, they got by the grace of God. There's no wisdom brought by man. So you look at books like Solomon or Ecclesiastes or any of these that are wisdom books. This book of wisdom is just more of that, more or less. But I really think it's important that it affirms that it's from God. It's a gift from God when you're given wisdom. The book of Sirach is the next book in it. I have that in here somewhere. I apologize for having to refer to this over and over. So this is one of the only books in the Apocrypha where the writer says himself he's the writer. It was written by a man named Yeshua ben Eliezer ben Sirah. which translated to Jesus, the son of Sirach of Jerusalem. Not the Jesus, obviously, but it was the name. And this was, again, during the second temple period. It's another wisdom book. It's kind of scattered, I'll be honest. It doesn't follow anything. So I can understand it's a tough read because it doesn't follow. The 1 minute it'll be a wisdom about this, then it'll jump to a whole other subject in the same chapter. So I understand some people might think that book is a little difficult to read, but I do think there's some really good wisdom in the book of Sirach, and I'm going to try to read, if I have time, to get just a few passages from it to show you that there's some really good stuff in there. The book of Baruch. This was a book written about 5 years after the destruction of Jerusalem by Babylonia. It's basically a national confession of sins, similar to Lamentations. It has a poem that identifies God with universal wisdom and the gift of God's Judaic law as being wisdom to men. Again, it's got lamentation and consolation. Jerusalem is personified as a widow who weeps. And of course, we see that as a theme in the Old Testament. If time and time again the Jews would do something where God would tell them to do something, or they wouldn't do it, or there would be a tragedy, and they would stop believing in God or stop believing that He was going to help them, and they have to keep going back and they keep basically lamenting that they did that. And we see that over and over. And this is also in the book of Baruch. The Epistle of Jeremiah. This is addressed to Jews who are about to be carried away as captives to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar. So this is just basically a book trying to exhort those Jews to stay faithful, stay in the faith, keep believing. I know things look bad now, but if you keep, don't forget, this is the God who's delivered us from these things before, going all the way back to the very beginning. And I think that's really even important for us now to remember when we go through bad times, and I'm as guilty as anybody of this, of forgetting what He's already done for us. So again, I think that's always a message that'll be important. The book of Susanna, or just Susanna as it's called, story of two judges who want to basically take this woman for themselves. She's a virtuous wife and refuses. They tell her they're going to accuse her of adultery if she doesn't do what she says. But a boy named Daniel doesn't believe the judges, so he speaks up. And this is the same Daniel of the Old Testament. So Daniel does away with one of the judges and tells a different, and basically goes on to show that they lied about her to get the people to revolt against these judges. So it's just another book of righteousness that prevailing over evil. Which, these judges were evil and were trying to take this lady for themselves. The prayer of Azariah, I think, is really interesting because it's attributed to Abednego. It's supposed to be the prayer. Now, obviously, who knows? But it's supposed to be prayer or a similar prayer to what he said before he was put into the furnace. For example, while he was the book says, while he stood in the fire and prayed aloud, "Blessed are you, O Lord, God of our ancestors, and worthy of praise, and glorious is your name forever." So, again, we've talked about how much faith and how much strength, courage it took for those boys to be put in there and survive that. And he's still blessing the Lord as this is going on. He's still exalting above all others while this terrible, unthinkable thing is happening with all this heat that kills the guards that bring them. It's so hot. So, again, I think there's no bad message in that. I feel like the prayer of Manasseh, it records that Manasseh was taken captive by the Assyrians, and while prisoner, Manasseh prayed for mercy, and upon being freed and restored, he turned back to his idolatrous ways. So this was a man who did not necessarily, he was freed and he went astray again. So this is kind of a warning against doing that. This is another book, and again, it just sort of goes back with a lot of what we know of in the Old Testament. Bel and the dragon, we've talked about it. The basic story is they create an idol that's at the time that's shaped like a dragon, and they command everybody to worship it. I think it's Daniel knows better, so he sets out to prove this dragon isn't real, And it's a short. It's one chapter and maybe about 40 verses. It's a really interesting read because he fools the people who do this idol, who feed it every day. He goes in there and he intercepts one of the meals and comes out. When they come to feed it one day, he's sitting there holding the bowl, eating out of it himself. And so it's another way of him disproving the idolatry of the time. It's an interesting book. It really is. And then you have the last book in the official Apocrypha, which is the Epistle to the Laodiceans. I knew I was going to mispronounce something eventually. The Laodiceans. It's just a short letter of about 20 verses written in Paul's name. It survived from 546, they say, and it's been accepted as an authentic letter of Paul at the Council of Nicaea. It's just a letter exhorting the church in Laodicea, a lot like he did to Ephesians and other churches, Philippians. It's just him exhorting them to continue in the faith. I guess maybe it might have been left out because it wasn't with the other letters. Some people call it a lost letter, but it really doesn't. The letter to the Laodiceans mentions Colossians 4:16 in it. So there's somebody who knew something about it.
What does our accepted King James Bible tell us about the Church of Laodicea?
Yeah. So this is to me, anything that furthers that is not a bad thing. Anything that kind of goes with that knowledge. I know I'm running super late, super long here, and I apologize. I just want to read a few passages out of the book of Sirach, if I can, real quick. Book of Sirach, I'm sorry. And these is nothing terribly insightful. I just want to show you that there is no heretic, nothing heretical about this, or nothing bad. And I hate to do any reading without you being able to read along, so I'm going to keep this very brief. I don't, obviously, if I'm reading, I want to be able to let you read out of it too, and I don't have enough copies to pass it around, or I would have loved to have done that. But in Sirach, 2nd chapter, first verse starts, "My son, if thou come to serve the Lord, prepare thy soul for temptation. Set thy heart aright, and constantly endure, and make not haste in time of trouble. Cleave unto him, and depart not away, that thou mayest be increased at thy end. Whatsoever is brought upon thee, take cheerfully, and be patient when thou art charged to a low estate. For gold is tried in the fire, and acceptable men in the furnace of adversity. Believe in him, and he will help thee. Order the way aright, and trust in him. Ye that fear the Lord, wait for his mercy, and go not aside, lest ye fall. Ye that fear the Lord, believe him, and your reward shall not fail. Ye that fear the Lord, hope for good, and for everlasting joy and mercy. Look at the generations of old and see, did ever any trust in the Lord, and was confounded? Or did any abide in his fear and was forsaken? Or whom did he ever despise that called upon him? For the Lord is full of compassion and mercy, long-suffering, and very pitiful, and forgiveth sins, and saveth in the time of affliction." So I don't know about you, but that sounds a lot like what we already know of in the Bible readings. I get goosebumps even reading it.
These people that wrote this like that book you just referring to there, the people that we hear of in the Bible wasn't the only people that day.
Right.
They weren't the only Christians in the New Testament.
A lot of times they were just the ones that were passed down by oral tradition, and they actually were written down.
Other Christian people or other believers in God of the Old Testament, did they not pray?
Yeah, we know they did, and I guess not.
We don't hear what.
Right.
We're just hearing what did he say wrong?
Yeah, that's all I'm trying to show is that there's nothing heretical or anti-Bible in here. I'm just trying to show that this is, if anything, it just dovetails right in with the Old Testament knowledge and into the New Testament. Read just a little bit more because I see people coming in, and I'll stop. In the 4th chapter, starting in verse 20, "Observe the opportunity and beware of evil, and be not ashamed when it concerneth thy soul. For there is a shame that bringeth sin, and there is a shame which is glory and grace. Accept no person against thy soul, and let not the reverence of any man cause thee to fall. And refrain not to speak when there is occasion to do good, and hide not thy wisdom in her beauty. For by speech wisdom shall be known, and learning by the word of the tongue. In no wise speak against the truth, but be abashed of the error of thine ignorance. Be not ashamed to confess thy sins, and force not the course of the river. Make not thyself an underling to the foolish man, neither accept the person of the mighty. Strive for the truth unto death, and the Lord shall fight for thee. So, I just wanted to bring some attention and why I think the Apocrypha is important, why it matters. And so, when I told Mike I would do some of this teaching, I really wrestled. I wrestled for a couple of weeks with what to talk about, but I kept coming back to this. And I realized this is not out of our modern Bible, but it was part of the King James Bible. It is part of the Bible as far as I'm concerned. And I just wanted to bring it forth for people who may not have heard of it or just didn't know it existed at all because it's not been printed regularly for 150, 200 years. And I just wanted to show people that there's nothing to be afraid of the original Apocrypha. It's not a bad thing. It's not an evil thing. It's just like more or less a supplement to what's already there. And no, it's not inspired, but it does show the people of the intertestamental period also prayed and also had faith and also kept the faith in that time waiting for the Messiah. So I thank you all for your attention. I appreciate it. Yes, sir.
You know, we read our Bible, and you think about it, what you're reading, it would have been took out, what you're saying. But you think about it, the Bible says he put everything in this book that was written, a book wouldn't hold it. That's pretty much what you're saying. I mean, that's what it's saying right there. It's there. We just don't pay no attention to it. It's not a bad thing to read it. You know, it's to help you understand what this book is really talking about.
And then
Something to think about.
the book of John, the Gospel according to John, that if everything, the books couldn't contain everything that Jesus did.
I've got several books at home of Jewish wisdom, of other writings of the time, of the Josephus and other things. So yeah, there's so many things you can read that support this if you really wanted to. Like it would take hundreds of volumes and then some. You couldn't